Hi there. In this lecture, we're going to be looking at plant poisoning with special emphasis on elephant's ear ingestion. Elephant's ear, which is one of the important causes of toxic exposure to plants in Zimbabwe. But we shall end the lecture by just giving a brief account, probably more of just pictures and one or two sentences on other important toxic plants which are found in Zimbabwe and which students should be aware of. So by the end of this talk, delegates must be able to describe the clinical toxicology of exposure to elephant's ear plant, and also must be able to identify a few other toxic plants and have an idea of their toxicology. If you look at your study guide, there are some blank spaces where you are supposed to fill in issues to do with the symptomatology, the description of the plants, the toxic components of the plants for the various plants that I shall mention right at the end. And also, as one of the activities, one of the things that you're supposed to do is to collect plants, to collect leaves for each and every one of the other toxic plants that we'll talk about. And at the end of all this, my hope is that everybody has actually learned something with regards to plant poisoning in Zimbabwe. Okay, so ingestion of plants by children is a common phenomenon worldwide, not only in developing countries or in Zimbabwe, but also in the more developed countries. And this is largely by virtue of the fact that children are quite inquisitive and they decide to experiment with their world using all of their senses, whether it's the sense of touch, the sense of smell, including the sense of taste. So they see something new, they say, that's interesting, I wonder what it tastes like, and then they take a quick bite of it. But sometimes you find that poisoning can actually occur as a result of hunger. When a child is hungry and they just see a plant and they associate it with food, and then they take a huge bite out of it, thinking that it's something that might actually nourish them. But there are the reasons perhaps which you can think about. So even though, worldwide there's a huge number of plants which are potentially toxic, some of them are quite lethal, but exposure of importance to toxicological plants, appears to be more common with certain species. And amongst the species, or perhaps the family which is the most important, is the Araceae family, or the Aram family, where elephant's ear belongs to. And this is the family that's the most common cause of symptomatic plant exposure, not only in Zimbabwe, but elsewhere. And I'm sure growing up, you're always told about this monster called elephant's ear and how you should stay away from it as a child. As we start, there's a paper which was published by Joshi and colleagues in the International Journal of Scientific Study, Volume 3, Issue 1 of April 2015, which gives an account of one of the plants that belong to this family, or which use this name of elephant's ear. And I should say, perhaps, right from the beginning, that elephant's ear is a name that's used colloquially, and it refers to these plants which have got these huge leaves which are shaped, which have got the shape of an ear of an elephant. So it could be Alocasia species, Colocasia species, but all of them basically have more or less the same symptomatology from a toxicological perspective. So in this particular case, we read about a child who was 1.5-year-old, who was brought in by a grandfather complaining of excessive crying, irritability, immediately after eating leaves of a household plant, which is known locally, and this is from India, is Abi or Hatikan, and I will show you the picture of it in subsequent slides. The paper says that the child developed redness of the buccal mucosa and of the tongue within 2 to 3 minutes, which is quite classical of ingestions of the elephant ear plants. So it says within 2 to 3 minutes after eating the leaves, and there was excessive drooling of secretions from the mouth after half an hour. And out of curiosity, the father also tasted the leaves of the plant, following which he also had inflammation and a painful blister at the tip of his tongue, as well as perioral numbness. I think the father actually took quite a significant amount of it. Um, it was not revealed it was not relieved, the pain, by home remedies like sweetened fluids, but lasted 8 to 10 hours. And on examination, at the time of admission, that's about an hour after eating the leaves, the child was still quite irritable, with an inconsolable cry, and had salivary drooling. And the lips and tongue were swollen and reddened, and he had dysphagia. On the second day, the leaves and the tuber were brought by the parents, which, after consultation with the botany department, were identified as being from a decorative home plant known as Alocasia mycorrhiza. Mycorrhiza. The patient was put on intravenous fluids, ranitidine, antacids, local antiseptic, anesthetic, mouth gel, and healing occurred by day 3, and the patient was discharged. He was asymptomatic on follow-up after about a week. And this is the plant which the child took, Alocasia mycorrhiza. And you see the shape, just like the shape of an ear of an elephant. So I thought I would start with that case because I think it's a beautiful case which actually demonstrates the symptomatology that one would expect from ingestion of elephant's ear, or exposure to it via the oral route. So what's elephant ear? So elephant ear plants, these are beautiful ornamental plants. Of course, beautiful is quite subjective, which normally have large elephant ear shaped leaves. And the leaves are normally green, but you can have them in other colors. Sometimes you get them in with cream, sometimes a bit of maroon. A number of plant species are referred to as elephant's ear, like I said earlier, but normally those belonging to the Colocasia and the Alocasia species are the ones which have got that name, or which take that name. And in some communities and localities, the tubers are actually used as food. And the plant is actually related to another very common plant called Dieffenbachia, which has got an elongated oblong-like leaves, ordinarily with green and cream. And it's unfortunate. I think the next time when I upgrade these notes, I'm going to have to put a picture of what Dieffenbachia looks like. But the toxicology is really more or less the same with what you'd get for elephant's ear poisoning. And then onto the toxicology, relating it to the case that we had. So all parts of the plant of elephant's ear are toxic on exposure, but the leaves are the ones that are normally eaten by children. And the plants contain calcium oxalate crystals, which are needle-shaped and are contained in compact bundles known as rhaphides. And if you have a look at this little sketch which I tried to put up there, on chewing, the calcium oxalate crystals are actually ejected and they actually lodge into the buccal cavity, resulting in the inflammation that we see. So chewing leads to expulsion of the calcium oxalate crystals, which are like little needles, and they lodge in the mouth, the tongue, and the throat. The crystals lead to inflammation of the oral cavity, including the throat, as well as severe pain. And I should say that, just like that father who was mentioned in the case, long ago when I was doing my PhD, of course, then subsequently later on, I did have a chance to just chew a bit on the plant. And yes, indeed, there is an almost immediate pain that occurs within 1 to 2 minutes, maybe 3 minutes. And then definitely inflammation that occurs. It's like almost like a burning type of pain. So a very uncomfortable plant, to get exposed to. So moving on, the calcium oxalate is not readily absorbed because it is ionized. And fortunately, in most cases of elephant's ear poisoning, 1 or 2 bites in the thorough mastication is enough actually to stop you from wanting to take several bites, because the pain really it comes on just like that. It's first almost absent, but then gradually builds up and you really don't want to be taking any other bite from the plant. However, in large doses, if the whole plant or the whole leaf is taken, the hydrochloric acid in the gastrointestinal tract actually can react to the calcium oxalate to form oxalic acid. And oxalic acid is unionized and therefore is freely absorbed. And on absorption, the oxalic acid leads to systemic effects of poisoning. And in my entire life, I have over 20 years experience working in a poison center and being a consultant, clinical toxicologist in cases of poisoning. I've only come across one case where someone actually tried to commit suicide by taking a full leaf of elephant's ear plant, and the symptoms were actually quite classical, like those that I am going to describe. So you see, once the oxalic acid gets absorbed into the blood circulation, the moment it gets into the blood, it becomes unionized, and then the oxalic acid, in essence, binds to calcium. So you get lots of calcium oxalate. But then because you're binding to calcium, there's a reduction of calcium ions in the circulation, and this can actually lead to muscular and cardiac problems. You can have muscular cramps as well as muscular weaknesses and other things like that. And that patient that I'm talking about, who was a male who took a whole plant after, he fall out with his girlfriend, actually exhibited those symptoms. In the kidney, the calcium binds to oxalic acid, leading to formation of calcium oxalate crystals, which can lead to formation of stones with nephrotoxicity as well as other renal issues occurring. But like I said earlier, most of the symptoms would actually occur almost immediately within the mouth. And that local inflammation is thought to be as a result of a number of mechanisms, including a direct effect of calcium oxalate on the buccal lining, like those little needles just, penetrating your buccal lining, or breaking of mast cells which might be in those particular areas, which then release, inflammatory mediators, or a release of proteolytic enzymes, on the grooves. It is believed that there might be some proteolytic enzymes on the grooves of the crystals. So the needles are not really smooth needles, but they've got little grooves where there might be some proteolytic enzymes. And also some have claimed that there might be some bradykinin-like substances on the crystals themselves, or which might be released from the body. So normally, like I said earlier, one bite is normally sufficient to discourage you from wanting to take another bite. And as a result of that, systemic effects are quite rare. But like I said earlier, these have been documented with the ingestion of larger quantities, e.g. a whole leaf. In this case, it's been documented briefly in a paper by Taguire and Bowl, which was published in 2002, which I expect that students should go and read, as this is part of your required reading. So concerning the clinical presentation, the local effects, basically there is pain, almost immediate, sharp pain. It feels as though, I could probably call it hot pain. And the pain is quite gradual but builds up in intensity, and it's pain in the mouth with or without inflammation which can occur. There might be swelling in the buccal mucosa, dysphagia, a burning sensation. You see the burning sensation I'm talking about. Dysphonia. There might be swelling in the pharynx. And actually, when you look at animal studies, the cause of death in animal studies after exposure to elephants is a result of swelling of the pharynx. So they basically asphyxiate, and then they die because of asphyxiation. However, there are no cases which have been reported to human beings, at least not to the best of my knowledge, where death has occurred as a result of swelling of the pharynx. So in cases where a large amount of the plant is taken, we've already talked about the effect that there's a reduction of calcium ions in circulation in the blood. And as a result, that could lead to muscular spasms and cramps. There could be bradycardia, hypotension, cardiac arrhythmias, respiratory failure, bradypnea, as well as renal insufficiency as a result of nephrotoxicity, which can occur because of the crystals being lodged in the kidneys. So with regards to the management, in cases where there appears to be a significant ingestion, the ABCs, we always start with ABCs. ABCs are the hallmark of anything in emergency medicine, to make sure that the airway is clear, that the patient is breathing, circulation, if need be, with regards to circulation, putting in a cannula for an IV, to be able to have IV with IV fluids or IV administration of medicines. And if, which would probably rarely occur, there is inflammation of the pharynx, then endotracheal intubation might be important, or tracheostomy. For the local symptoms, which are basically what we would probably see in most of the cases, it may be a good idea to rinse the mouth with cold water. But I should say it's when I took the liberty of tasting it, yeah, it's easier said that cold water works, but really, I guess it has to be really cold water. But at Malsent, very cold water or an ice cream or a juice might actually work over time to reduce. In this case that we saw that the demulcent didn't seem to do much, didn't seem to help much in that 1.5-year-old child that we read about earlier. And it might be necessary to give the patient simple analgesics like your paracetamol. Antacids may be used. We did see that they did go quite beyond because there was ranitidine as well. But I would say, whether it's magnesium trisilicate, aluminum hydroxide, something like that, something nice and mild might actually help. But really, this poisoning is pretty self-limiting. It's just to try and make sure that the child is as, comfortable in quotes as possible as they go through it. And the benefit of corticosteroids and or antihistamines remains unquestionable. And, as a general suggestion, we recommend that they should not be used. In the rare cases where systemic poisoning may occur, remember our main issue is calcium. So what we want to do is to actually replace or replenish the calcium, and this can be done by giving calcium gluconate or calcium chloride to replenish calcium ions. And we can give fluids because remember we say that there might be some formation of calcium oxalate crystals in the kidneys, so the fluids might actually be able to help in terms of dissolving. But again, this is important to be done with balance because you also don't want to overload the kidneys, which might already have these renal stones in them or might already have suffered some form of damage. And then you basically go back to default settings where we have supportive and symptomatic therapy as need be. And then in terms of the laboratory tests that you do, your standard lab tests, in oxalic acid poisoning, the urine actually, when examined under the microscope, you can actually see some oxalic acid crystals which have been formed. Then what to monitor? Basically the airway, cardiovascular system, the renal system. And in a nutshell, that is what traditional elephant's ear poisoning will lead to. And that's a paper by Tabire and Bull, which is required reading for those taking up the clinical toxicology course, and gives a pretty fair account of management of elephant's ear poisoning, and has been really cited quite extensively in standard texts when it comes to elephant's ear poisoning. And then now that that's done, I just want us to quickly go through some common plants that you will come across in Zimbabwe. If you have already gone through the lecture on traditional medicine poisoning, you'll see that some of these plants are basically a repetition. And I expect that everybody should know these plants and see them. The first one is Neram eloyanda, which has been used in Zimbabwe for the management of various illnesses, but more specifically for the management of STIs or sexually transmitted illnesses. In fact, there's a lovely case which is documented in the book by Michael Gelfand et al., the traditional medical practitioner of Zimbabwe, the 1985 book, where there's a couple, a boyfriend and a girlfriend who had some STI, decided to make some tea using these leaves. The young gentleman had 1.5 cups of the tea, if I recall, and then the young lady had less than that, and it is said that they got ill, and as they were leaving the house to go to the hospital, the young man collapsed by the door, and he actually died, but the young woman actually survived. So a very toxic plant, And I would like students to then go through their course guides and fill those in with regards to what type of clinical symptomatology you would expect from them. Like I said earlier, these are cardiac glycosides in essence, but just go fill in the symptomatology, what the active principle is, which parts of the plant are toxic, etc. Another plant which is closely related to this one, which we find also a lot in Zimbabwe, especially here in Harare, in the Avondale area, we find a lot of this particular plant, which is the Thevetia peruviana. Basically, symptomatology more or less the same as Nerium oleander, but again, students should just go study, find out, what is out there in the literature, fill in your course guides, get the leaves, get to know this particular plant. Get to know what are the signs and symptoms of poisoning. If I say cardiac glycosides, already you must be thinking about the cardiovascular system as the target organ of toxicity, especially the heart. So I will not say anything more about that one. The other plant that we have, which is a toxic plant, also used in traditional medicine, is Ricinus communis, from where we get the toxic substance ricin, which, as you would know, the story of Georgy Markov. We talked about it when we introduced toxicology. He was killed by ricin. If you remember, he was a Bulgarian who had exiled to the United Kingdom, and then at some point, someone came with an umbrella, which was actually a little weapon, and shot a little, what do you call it, a bead, which was actually impregnated with ricin, and the person died. So again, fill in your course guide, clinical signs and symptoms, which parts of the plant are toxic, etc., what to expect, what the management is, and this will be good for you. So that's Ricinus communis. I'm sure you've seen this one, known as Mfuta in Shona. The other one is Abrus Precatorius, also known as the rosary bead, which you should also go and read about. Said to be to contain one of the most toxic substances known to men, known as abrin. Toxicity quite similar to ricin. So again, go and find out, read about it, and then fill in your course guide. And these plants are actually examinable. You will come across these in the quizzes that I'll be giving you concerning poisoning from plants. The next plant is Jatropha curcas, or Jatropha curcas, or Jatropha curcas. I don't know exactly how you want to pronounce it, but that's one plant which has been used a lot in Zimbabwe, often as a hedge to stop, cattle from crossing over into other people's yards, and contains these beans. So that they have got pods which have got these black looking beans on nuts. The fascinating thing about this plant is that these nuts actually taste like peanuts. They taste good. I remember as a young PhD student years ago reading about this, working at the poison center, and then with a case where somebody was actually poisoned by one, and they brought the seeds to the poison center, and I took the liberty just to take a little bite out of them. Remember, it is the dose that makes the poison, so it was really, don't try it at home, but it was a well calculated move, and it does actually taste like peanuts. And we do have cases of children being poisoned by this. There was one case which was in the local papers 2 or 3 years ago, I think somewhere in Bulawayo, where some children had a meal of these seeds, and they suffered severe gastrointestinal signs and symptoms. So again, familiarize yourself with the plant, but not only that, know what the symptomatology looks like, and probably what type of management you would suggest as a pharmacist or a clinical pharmacologist wherever you're working. And then this one is Datura stramonium. Datura stramonium contains hyoscine-like alkaloids, atropine-like alkaloids. Has been used in traditional medical practice, and other people abuse the little seeds and they smoke them, together with mbanje or your cannabis, and then they get a high. Remember, your atropine can actually give you some euphoria. Some interesting cases have been documented in Africa, where I think it was in Tanzania, if I recall, but somewhere in East Africa up there, where the plants were growing together with the maize, and then during the harvest, they took the maize together with some of this Datura stramonium, It was ground to make mealie meal. The mealie meal was used at a funeral, and many people got ill as a result of this particular plant. So know it, know the symptomatology, what type of management you would actually recommend. And then this one is one plant that I have worked with for several years, I think almost 2 decades now. Boophone disticha, psychotropic plant with central nervous system type of effects. Quite toxic. Boophone itself means cattle killer. And it's been used, even for fishing, where they would throw, the bulb or crushed parts of the bulb into a river. The fish die, they get the fish, and then they would eat them eventually. Also been used by some of the Khoisan and other hunter-gatherers in southern Africa as a concoction together with other plants for hunting purposes. Quite a toxic plant, fascinating plant. I've got a lot to say about it, but I will hold myself for today. People must read about it, know as much as you can about this before the sticker. And then finally, another plant that I would like the students to know about is Gloriosa superba, which is our national plant. Contains colchicum alkaloids from your colchicine. So basically the toxicology would be similar to that which you get when you get an overdose of colchicine, which makes things easier for you as pharmacists and pharmacologists to read about. So read about it, know the plant, and see how best you can you would address or deal with a person who's been exposed to it. On elephant's ear poisoning as well as plant poisoning, and like you see, I'm expecting that students spend more time doing the research for themselves, especially with regards to all the other different plants that we have. So just to recap on the things that we said we wanted to achieve. So we said delegates must be able to describe the clinical toxicology of exposure to elephant's ear poisoning, and I hope now you can do that. And students must be able to identify a few other toxic plants and have an idea of their toxicity or toxicology, and I hope you'll be able to do that. And I hope and pray that you manage to learn something. Otherwise, God bless you and thank you for your time and for listening. Best wishes with your quiz. Goodbye. So just some notable mentions that raw tomatoes and the leaves of tomatoes are actually quite toxic. They might have stramonium alkaloids. And those are things that students should also read about, raw potatoes as well as the leaves. The pips of plums and the pips of apples as well as the plum seeds contains anogenic alkaloids, which students should also go and read about. Cassava, especially bitter cassava from the eastern parts of the country, is also quite toxic, and I expect students to also read a bit about that. So yeah, this is the lecture which I had for you.